Weird history stories aren't always stories that were seen as weird at the time. As time goes on, things that were once considered normal can suddenly become extremely unusual. However, these weird history stories go beyond cultural norms changing. In February of 1637, the price of tulip bulbs in the Netherlands plummeted. People who had been betting on the price increasing lost everything. The collapse impacted every aspect of society, and many Dutch merchants found themselves bankrupt. The real history behind Tulip Mania wasn't quite as drastic as it was later made out to be. The Dutch economy wasn't destroyed, and the people who lost the most money were the ones that could afford it. But the strange tale of how a bulb could be worth as much as a house is just as weird. In the early 1600s, the Dutch economy was going from strength to strength. The country had just become independent from Spain, and merchants from the Dutch East India Company were bringing back exotic plants and spices, and other things from Asia. Among these were tulips, which are actually native to Kazakhstan. Tulips were very rare. Even rarer were tulips infected with a virus that caused the unusual solid colors on the petals to become striped. They were considered the most beautiful and were a symbol of significant wealth. Once the flowers became seen as something only the wealthy could afford, the price was driven up. Paying over the odds for something because you believe someone will pay even more isn't a new phenomenon, and this is where Tulip Mania began. While some accounts claim everyone from nobles to chimney sweeps were caught up in Tulip Mania, it was only really the richest in society. Many saw the entire thing as foolish, and satirical pieces were written about it, which later historians would take to be serious. The price of tulip bulbs were exceedingly high, though. It wasn't uncommon for a bulb to cost as much as what a skilled worker would earn in a year. The most expensive bulb we actually have records of cost 5,200 guilders, 20 times the annual salary of a skilled worker. But this seems to have been very rare. The bubble burst in 1637. Whether it was because people decided they didn't want to spend that much for a flower, or if an influx of bulbs meant they weren't rare anymore is unknown. The economy didn't end up in shambles, and there aren't actually any records of anyone losing their businesses. What was more of an issue is that a lot of trade at the time was done on promises to buy later. These promises were always upheld, but when the bubble burst, people who had promised to pay hundreds for bulbs would no longer do so. This break in cultural norms was much more significant, though it's usually overlooked when this period of weird history is remembered today. Frederick Willam Voit is a folklore hero whose life has inspired plays, films, and TV shows, and whose waxwork figure is in the Madame Tussauds Museum. Unlike other figures that have risen to his level of fame, Voit was not a political figure. He didn't achieve his fame through music or the arts and wasn't born into royalty. He was a criminal, but one whose real history has captured people's imaginations over the years. It was even admired by a German emperor. Voit was born in 1849 in East Prussia, the son of a shoemaker. He was supposed to go into the same profession as his father, and he did, but Voit had other plans on how to make money. Between 1860 and 1890, Voit was in and out of prison, having begun a career of theft, fraud, and false statements. It was nothing too serious, and he probably would have been forgotten if not for his most audacious crime at the start of the 20th century. It was October of 1906. Somehow, Voit had acquired the uniform of an army captain in Berlin. He went to a nearby town and approached a troop of soldiers. These soldiers had never seen him before, but believed Voit when he told them that he was an army captain, and marched them 20 miles to the town of Copenhagen. According to Voit, the mayor of the town was to be arrested, and the town's assets seized. Of course, the mayor hadn't done anything wrong, but the troops were obedient to the man that they thought was their army officer. The troops stormed the mayor's office and arrested him. Voit demanded to see the cash box, which contained the town's funds. He confiscated the 4,000 marks inside, which is worth roughly $30,000 in today's money. The Köpenick mayor was taken to Berlin. After hours at the police station, the police and army realized that the whole thing had been a trick. By this point, Voit was already long gone. The German people found the story amusing, as did Kaiser Wilhelm II, but the army wasn't as happy about being made to look like idiots. It didn't take them long to track Voit down, and he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. The Kaiser himself pardoned Voit after just 2 years though. Voit spent the rest of his life earning money from his infamy. He did work for a brief time as a shoemaker, but also wrote a memoir about his life, starred in shows about himself, including shows in the US and Canada, and posed for pictures in an army officer's uniform. He would pass away in 1922 and was buried in the Notre Dame Cemetery, where his grave is frequently visited by tourists who leave coins to honor him. As Halloween of 1944 approached, the Canadian government had a real-life zombie problem to contend with. There were thousands of zombies unhappy about speculation that they might be sent overseas to fight in the European theaters of the Second World War. At the same time, the general public were equally unhappy that the zombies weren't being sent. While the idea of modern media depictions of zombies going to fight the Axis powers sounds like a bad video game, Canada's zombie army was a real period of weird history. At the time, zombies hadn't gotten the monster image we think of today. It was still a term very much tied to historical traditions, and would most often refer to a mindless, obedient servant. Somehow, the word became used to describe conscripted men who refused to fight overseas. During the First World War, conscription had been a divisive issue in Canada, and the government in the 1940s were trying to avoid it happening again. Conscription still went into place, but only people who volunteered to fight overseas would be sent abroad. The others would work in administrative roles in Canada, or defending the Canadian coasts. At first, this wasn't much of a problem. Using predictions made on British casualties, the army knew how many recruits it needed to train for different roles and had enough volunteers to make sure they had enough troops in Europe. But as the fighting became more intense, they realized the calculations they'd been using were wrong. Not enough men were being trained. At home, the tensions between the men labeled as zombies and general servicemen were becoming worse and worse. In 1943, a riot broke out when general servicemen sang a song called "Salute to a Zombie" at a group of men who refused to fight overseas. Canada was split on the subject of whether young men should be forced into the horrific landscape that was Western Europe at the time. English Canadians were generally for this conscription, while French Canadians were generally against it. In October of 1944, the situation was almost at a breaking point. The Prime Minister hired a recently retired army officer as his defense minister to try to convince conscripts to volunteer to fight. But the plan failed. In November, plans to send 17,000 zombies to fight in Europe were put into place. Thankfully, the fighting became lighter that winter, and the casualty numbers dropped back to a manageable rate. About 2,500 were sent, and 69 lost their lives. The early to mid-11th century was an extremely weird period in history for the Catholic Church. The position of Pope was not just a religious role, but a person who held secular power, and making sure that they had the right man for the job was extremely important. However, it wasn't something that was often treated with that much importance. In 1032, one of the most controversial popes in history rose to power. Benedict IX was born into a powerful noble family that held a lot of political power in Italy. He was the nephew of 2 popes, and when Pope Benedict VIII passed away in 1032, his father had put him in charge. How old he was at this point is disputed. A historic writing close to that time period claimed he was just 12 years old, though he could have been as old as 20. What is certain is that he wasn't at all prepared for the role. Benedict was known to steal from the church, taking the lives of his political opponents. committing adultery, and breaking other church laws in his time as Pope. At one point, he fled Rome after political opponents tried to take his life, but the Holy Roman Emperor put him back in power. Most people at the time agreed that this was a bad decision. One of the cardinals described him as a demon from hell disguised as a priest. In 1045, the people of Rome chased him out of the city, and a new pope was elected. But 2 months later, Benedict returned and deposed his short-lived successor. Another 2 months passed, and Benedict changed his mind. He wanted to marry his cousin, which he couldn't do as pope, so he let his godfather buy the papacy from him. Benedict was free to marry his cousin, who then rejected him. Naturally, Benedict wanted the papacy back, but it wasn't going to be as easy as it had been the first time. The Holy Roman Emperor had passed away some years earlier, and a new one couldn't be crowned without a legitimate pope. Henry III of Germany was trying to get himself crowned and needed to sort out the papacy. He had Benedict, his godfather, and another man who was claiming the position dismissed, and instead had his personal confessor installed as Pope Clement II. Clement lasted almost a year before he passed away. At this point, Benedict jumped on the opportunity and had himself crowned for a third time. But Henry III's army drove him out after a few months. What happened after this point is uncertain, but Benedict opted to not try for a fourth term in power. Some say he spent the rest of his life repenting for his sins, while others claimed he kept doing the same things that he had done as Pope. The papacy after that settled down, leaving behind the weird history for the time being. There would be other strange historical moments, but none would quite match what Benedict IX managed to achieve. The London beer flood of 1814 was exactly what it sounds like. This piece of weird history is largely forgotten, but had a large impact on beer breweries in the decades afterwards. The Moo & Company's Horseshoe Brewery was located in the neighborhood of St. Giles. It was a poor neighborhood which had become home to many Irish people who had relocated to London. Poverty and crime was high. In 1810, the brewery company had installed a 22-foot-tall wooden fermentation tank. It was able to hold over 3,500 barrels and was held together with multiple iron rings. 2 or more times a year, one of the rings would break and need to be replaced. But it had never caused a problem before. It was the mid-afternoon on October 17th. Most of the men that lived in the crowded houses that surrounded the brewery were at work, leaving only women and young children home when the disaster occurred. At around 4:30 p.m., a storehouse clerk noticed that one of the iron rings had broken. He informed his boss but was told it wouldn't be an issue, and to inform someone to come fix it at a later date. The clerk went on with his work until about an hour later when he heard a massive eruption from the storeroom. The pressure from the fermentation tank had been too much for the remaining rings, and the tank was now nothing more than 1 million splinters of wood. Gallons of hot beer had toppled the wall of the brewery, and the force of the eruption was so much that the other tanks and barrels had burst open. The beer caused a 15-foot tsunami of alcohol to pour into the surrounding streets. Given it was such a poor neighborhood, there was no drainage system, and the alcohol flooded the basements of houses. 2 houses collapsed due to the damage. In all, 8 people lost their lives in the disaster. Strangely, it became somewhat of a macabre attraction in the days afterward, with people paying a few pennies to look at the wreckage of the brewery. Of course, the free alcohol also attracted people, and there were unconfirmed reports of a 9th person losing his life due to alcohol poisoning. The accident was determined to be an act of God, so the brewery didn't have to pay any compensation. The incident did lead to wooden tanks being phased out, with concrete vats becoming more commonplace. Weirdly, this wouldn't be the only tidal wave of alcohol in British history. In 1906, something similar happened at a whiskey distillery in Glasgow. It wasn't until the mid-1800s that scientists realized some of the strange fossils of ancient humans weren't our ancestors, but another branch of human evolution that we could have gone down. These were Neanderthals. named after Neander Valley, where the species was first identified. Since their discovery, our understanding of this ancient human species has evolved significantly, but there are still many mysteries we don't understand. One of the largest and ever-evolving is the cause of their extinction roughly 40,000 years ago. Scientists believe there were at least 9 hominid species that once existed on Earth. Not all would have interacted with Homo sapiens, modern humans. Some are only found in fossils from the islands of Indonesia, and likely would never have come across our own ancient ancestors. But others would have interacted with us a lot. The manner of this interaction is something that researchers are still trying to understand. One species we know interacted with Homo sapiens a fair amount was the Neanderthals. This is the one hominid species we know the most about, other than sapiens, but that's still not very much. It's believed they lived around Europe and Western Asia between 400,000 years ago up until 40,000 years ago. Popular images of these ancient people depict them as unintelligent and aggressive. It's assumed that humans were simply able to defeat them with our superior intellect. But more recent studies into the remains of Neanderthals and their settlements show a species that was a lot more like us than we once thought. When it comes to appearance, there are some obvious differences. The Neanderthals had spent thousands of years adapting to the harsh climates further north, even surviving the Ice Age. That leads to them being shorter and stockier than their Homo sapien cousins. Their rib cages were shorter, wider, and deeper, and they had larger musculature to help them hunt Ice Age animals. They also had larger eyes, which may have been an adaptation to allow them to hunt during the longer winter nights. But their brains were roughly the same size as Homo sapiens. The brain power of Neanderthals is still hotly debated among experts. Some have suggested that their larger eyes and heavier bodies would have required more processing power, so there wouldn't have been as much room for complex problem solving as in sapiens. But there is evidence of that complex thought. Neanderthals used tools, and the oldest found bone tool was actually created by this species. There's also evidence that they developed trinkets that were meant for decorative purposes. Some of the ancient cave art might have been created by Neanderthals, and we know that they likely used animal hides for clothes. It's even believed that they created some kind of foot covering. But if it wasn't a lack of intelligence that led to the Neanderthals going extinct, what was it? This is an extremely difficult question to answer. Scientists have pointed out that figuring out why modern animal species are going extinct can be difficult. So answering this question about a species that we know very little about is even harder. Pinpointing exactly when it happened has also been difficult for researchers. The latest estimate is that it was between 41,000 and 39,000 years ago, but that's moved about a lot as new scientific techniques have led to better radiocarbon dating techniques. It's believed that most Neanderthals had been wiped out before the eruption of the supervolcano Campiflagre in Italy, roughly 39,000 years ago. This eruption coated much of Eastern Europe, North Africa, and West Asia in a layer of ash, and there don't seem to be any Neanderthal remains found above that layer. Scientists have speculated that there may have been small pockets that survived up until this point, but the general Neanderthal population had disappeared. But that estimate of roughly 40,000 years ago leaves tens of thousands of years where humans and Neanderthals coexisted in Europe. It wasn't a case of sapiens uprooting Neanderthals and quickly taking their place. There's even evidence that the opposite occurred sometimes. Archaeologists found a settlement in southern France that with Homo sapien tools and a tooth dated to 54,000 years ago. It's believed that Neanderthals lived there for roughly 20,000 years before a roughly 2,000-year period where Homo sapiens lived there. The Homo sapiens later disappeared, and the site was unoccupied for a while before Neanderthals returned. It seems unlikely this wasn't a violent overthrow by Homo sapiens, but it might have been that sapiens were simply able to outcompete our Neanderthal cousins for resources, especially in more difficult conditions. One key difference between the two species is the level of social networking. Neanderthals stayed in small groups. Flint from the tools they used typically came from the local area, but humans were able to sustain larger social networks. The material from their tools could originate far away from where the tools were found, showing a level of cooperation that wasn't seen in Neanderthals. If food in one area was scarce, humans would have been able to trade with neighbors from other areas, while Neanderthals didn't have that ability. Another more recent theory suggests that disease could have played a key role in wiping out the Neanderthals. When sapiens and Neanderthals first came into contact, they would have had entirely different diseases, which the other group wouldn't have had any resistance to. According to models, the two groups would have been able to coexist with limited interactions for a while, with the disease barrier between them. Over time, the groups would gradually build up tolerances to the other's diseases. Children born from Neanderthal and Homo sapien parents would have sped up the process. Once humans were able to tolerate Neanderthal diseases, they would be able to break through the disease barrier. Interacting with Neanderthals more would then make the northern species sick, but with little effect on the humans. Diseases would then quickly spread through Neanderthal groups and wipe them out. Other theories suggest it might have just been a numbers game. There were more Homo sapiens than Neanderthals. Any famine or disease that had an impact on the population of all human species would hurt the Neanderthals more, simply because they didn't have the numbers to recover. Mating between the two species would also limit the Neanderthals' numbers more than the Homo sapiens. It's also likely that a mixture of these reasons caused the extinction of this species. Neanderthals lived as far north as Belgium, south to the Mediterranean, west to Spain, and east to Asia. Events happening in one region might not have had an impact on other regions. Studies of lake sediments in Italy showed that the climate change that was happening in northern Europe wasn't having much of an impact here. So it could be that diseases had a greater impact in this region, while climate change and a lack of resources could have caused problems in more northern regions. Our understanding of Neanderthals is constantly evolving, with many earlier assumptions being overturned with new discoveries. It's possible that we may never get to the bottom of this mystery, with every new discovery only leading to more questions. But we've made significant progress. Understanding what happened to the Neanderthals and other hominin species might give us an insight into what could happen to other species, including our own. Today, the Greek island of Santorini is a popular holiday destination, boasting picturesque villages and good food. But these buildings are perched upon an active volcano, one that's the subject of a decades-old mystery. Santorini is possibly most famous for the destructive eruption that shook the eastern Mediterranean, sometime around 1600 BC. For centuries before then, the island had been home to a thriving Bronze Age culture. It was part of the Minoan sphere of influence, and is likely the most famous Minoan location outside the island of Crete. The largest settlement would have been the city of Akrotiri. The settlement would have come to an end in one of the largest volcanic eruptions of the Holocene epoch. The island had been built up over the course of hundreds of thousands of years by volcanic eruptions and caldera collapses. There had been some volcanic activity during human history, but it hadn't stopped people from making their homes on its slopes. But at some point around 1600 BC, the seismic activity hinted that something much more destructive was going to happen. The city of Akrotiri was abandoned, and the population relocated to other parts of the Mediterranean. And then the island erupted. The volcanic eruption would have been between a 7 and 8 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. It threw ash and debris into the atmosphere that would have an impact around the world. Some scholars believe people as far away as China might have written about the yellow skies and strange weather caused by the ash. Akrotiri was completely encased in ash, giving future historians an insight into what life might have been like for the ancient Minoans. On top of the ash, tsunamis caused destruction on neighboring islands. Much of the island was destroyed in the eruption, and today the scars are clear to be seen in aerial photos. An eruption of this magnitude would have had an impact on the surrounding civilizations, and it may have even inspired the myth of Atlantis. But today, the eruption has a lasting impact on archaeology. The ash layer provided archaeologists with a marker that could be used to determine the age of other layers during archaeological digs. Artifacts found beneath the ash would have originated before the eruption, while those found above the ash would have been from afterwards. Given the time frame and location, this would be very useful for historians. Many of the most famous ancient civilizations would have been in this region. The only problem with this is that historians can't figure out when exactly the eruption took place. The first excavations of Akrotiri took place around 1967, following a theory that the destruction of Santorini was to blame for the destruction of Minoan palaces in Crete in 1450 BC. Originally, excavations didn't quite line up with this theory, but it seemed like the eruption could have been the beginning of the end for the Minoan civilization. Pottery is a very useful indicator for archaeologists, with different styles and practices going in and out of use. The type of pottery used in Akrotiri is a style known as Late Minoan 1A. Egypt's carefully kept chronology allows archaeologists to give a precise date for when artifacts were used in the Egyptian kingdom. The Late Minoan 1A pottery was found towards the end of the Egyptian New Kingdom, around 1500 BC. That put the destruction of Akrotiri roughly 50 years before the Minoan collapse. It was possible that the site was abandoned long before the eruption actually took place. We know that the city was definitely abandoned, as there were no human remains like those found at Pompeii. However, historians believe this would have only happened a few years at most before the eruption. The knock-on effects of the eruption might have caused the end of the Minoan civilization, but it wasn't caused directly by the eruption and tsunamis. For a long time, this date of 1500 BC was accepted by scholars, but more research has changed that theory. Radiocarbon dating gave new possible dates, which suggested that the eruption might have taken place up to 100 years before the 1500 BC assumption. Radiocarbon dating can be difficult to get right, with many people claiming it's downright inaccurate at times. There are natural fluctuations in the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and the calibration is ever-changing as more information about the Earth's history is uncovered. But study after study found that trees, seeds, and animals preserved in the ash on Santorini had all passed away much earlier than 1500 BC. The most recent radiocarbon dating attempt placed the eruption of Santorini between 1609 and 1560 BC, with a 95.4% probability, and between 1606 and 1589, with a 68.3% probability. That estimation puts the eruption within Egypt's Second Intermediate Period, and shortly after the end of the Old Babylonian Empire. Dating from tree rings and ice cores has also been used to try to get to the bottom of the mystery. Trees from Belfast in California were analyzed and found to have had narrow growth rings around 1630 BC, slightly earlier than the radiocarbon dating estimates. While tree rings do give a very precise year, the problem is that it's impossible to know for certain what causes the growth patterns. A volcanic winter would cause limited growth in Belfast and possibly as far away as California, but there could be other reasons for this limited growth. There could have been other volcanic eruptions that might be responsible. The same problem arises when using ice cores to determine the date of volcanic eruptions. One ice core in Greenland seemed to have evidence that the eruption happened at a certain date, but it was determined that the ash couldn't have come from the Santorini eruption. At the moment, it appears that experts have more faith in the radiocarbon dating method than in using pottery in the Egyptian chronology to date the eruption. But that then leaves the question of how pottery from decades or even a century after the eruption was found at Santorini. It's possible this was due to problems in Egypt. The Egyptian intermediate periods weren't complete dark ages, but there were periods of significant upheaval when the pharaoh didn't have complete control over the kingdom. It's easy to imagine that trade with the outside world might not have been happening in the usual manner, so the pottery from Minoan civilizations didn't appear in the Egyptian record until much later, after the new kingdom was established. It could also be that the pottery found on Santorini was closer to prototypes of the style that would become fashionable decades later. For now, the answer of between 1609 and 1560 BC gives historians something to work with, but archaeologists and researchers continue to work to find a definitive answer to this problem. The study of alchemy dates back to Hellenistic Egypt and appears in ancient Indian and Chinese texts. In 1144, a Latin translation of an Arabic work reintroduced the topic to Europe. Throughout the medieval and into the early modern period, alchemy fascinated scholars as much as chemistry, physics, or any other natural science. Some of the texts from this period have survived, leaving modern viewers baffled as to what the symbols and cryptic poetry might be referring to. Of these texts, the Ripley Scroll may be one of the most mysterious. Sir George Ripley was a famous alchemist who lived in England between 1415 and 1490. He was a priest, author, and poet, and his writing went on to inspire the likes of John Dee and Isaac Newton. At the time, alchemy was seen as no different to any other sciences, and would make people like Newton famous. Unsurprisingly, Ripley wrote about the elusive and famous Philosopher's Stone. Even people without much interest in alchemy have heard of this supposed artifact. It was the primary goal of most alchemists, a stone or power which turned base metals into gold or silver. Some also believe it had rejuvenation or life-giving properties. It went by other names and was sometimes simply called the elixir. For alchemists of Ripley's time, it had an important connection with Christianity too. Only something pure was believed to have the ability to do what the stone could, and so the stone became a symbol of Jesus Christ. This would explain how Ripley and other alchemists could practice and study the art while continuing to practice their religion. Ripley wrote many works, including On the Stone, but the most famous piece attached to his name might not actually be by the famous alchemist. The Ripley Scroll is believed to have been created sometime in the 15th century. The original is lost today, but we do have around 21 copies, which were made between the mid-15th and early 16th century. The scrolls vary in size, but most are around 6 meters in length, which would have made it very difficult to display or read. There are a few different versions of the scroll, though most follow the same patterns with similar images. At the top of the scroll is an image of a bearded man believed to be Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary Egyptian sage associated with the god Thoth. He stands over a large alchemical flask. In the flask, we see 7 images of people conducting alchemical experiments, and a drawing of the biblical Adam and Eve. In the center of these images are what appears to be an alchemist and a priest. Moving down through the scroll, Adam and Eve appear again, standing in a pool of water beside the Tree of Knowledge. Further down is the image of a dragon eating a frog, 2 lions beside a fire, and a golden phoenix. The penultimate image is that of the Philosopher's Stone, depicted as 3 orbs, 1 red, 1 white, and 1 black. The stone is held aloft by a dragon that seems to be eating its own tail. At the bottom of the scroll is another person holding a quill pen, as if this had all been written by the small figure. Throughout the scroll are pieces of poetry written by Ripley about the stone, which is why the work has been attributed to him. But the oldest versions of the Ripley Scroll do not have these verses, and it's possible these were added later to give the scroll more legitimacy. The images are shrouded in symbolism, and we can only guess at what the meanings were. The entire thing is believed to be a recipe for the stone itself. According to the British Library, Adam and Eve are supposed to represent sulfur and mercury, 2 ingredients that were essential to creating the white stone. Other interpretations see them representing the sun and the moon. The British Library describes the dragon eating the frog as symbolizing the spontaneous creation of the black stone. Even if the Philosopher's Stone were real, it's clear that our current understanding of the Ripley Scroll wouldn't be enough to follow the recipe and create the elixir. Putting aside the mystical nature of alchemy, there are still many unanswered questions about the scrolls. Researchers aren't certain what the scroll actually would have been used for. One theory was that they were used in alchemy shops as a form of advertisement, but the copies of the scroll we have today are in relatively good condition. They obviously weren't hanging in the open for any great period of time. They're also extremely long, which would make them unpractical in most places. But there are very few other reasons why this would appear in the form of one long scroll, rather than a folio or booklet. In the scroll form, it's impractical, and would have been difficult for anybody to view the entire piece easily. That may just have been part of the aesthetics of the scroll, though. It wasn't designed to be understood by most people. The images are deliberately cryptic, and only those with experience in alchemy or with similar texts would have been able to decipher the meaning. It could be that having it in this form, rather than something more easily readable, could have been another way to protect it from outsiders. Finding out who created the Ripley Scroll could help solve this mystery. Ripley wrote books on his studies into alchemy, and doesn't seem overly concerned about keeping alchemy a secret. There's nothing to prove for certain that this wasn't by him, though later writers who referenced Ripley's works didn't reference the scroll. It seems more likely his verses were attached to it later, possibly to add to its appeal, or to make things a little easier to understand. The truth of the Ripley Scroll remains shrouded in mystery. Medieval copies of the scroll have sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars at auction, but anybody wishing to crack the mystery can view the manuscript online. In the 1960s, workers at a quarry near Peterborough, England, came across buried pieces of ancient wood deep in the clay. It wasn't until the 1990s that they realized just what they had uncovered. Quarrying stopped immediately, and the investigation into this Bronze Age settlement began. The official name for this archaeological site is Must Farm, but the nickname, the Pompeii of the Fens, hints at just how significant a find this was. Sometime around 1250 BC, a settlement of around 8 round houses had been built around a slow-moving river in what is today Cambridgeshire. The houses were built on stilts and surrounded by a wooden wall or palisade. It would have been a tight-knit community and home to several individual families. Artifacts found within the home seemed to indicate that they were relatively wealthy. There were glass and amber beads from as far away as Syria and Turkey, as well as hordes of tools and weapons, textile covers for the walls and floors, and an abundance of food. The people here kept lambs, but there was also evidence of agriculture and hunting. They may have even enjoyed honey-glazed venison, as both honey and deer meat were found together on some artifacts recovered from the site. They also had dogs that ate scraps from the humans. But life at Must Farm was suddenly turned upside down in a devastating blaze. Archaeologists believe it would have happened in the late summer or autumn, judging by the age of the lambs whose remains were recovered. It happened so quickly the people living there didn't have any time to take cherished belongings or even rescue the dogs. They fled from the houses before the roofs collapsed and plunged the whole building into the river below. In what would have been a short amount of time, the entire settlement was destroyed. The soft silt of the riverbed cushioned the fall. The oxygen-starved conditions perfectly preserved the remains, which were then covered by meters of silt and clay and forgotten to history. By the time archaeologists were able to excavate the site, only the remains of 4 of the round houses were preserved. It's believed at least another 4 had existed before they were destroyed by quarrying. But these 4 houses still provided valuable insight into what life would have been like for people in Bronze Age Britain. There are a few Bronze Age sites that have been found in Britain, though it seems that archaeological sites from the later Iron Age are much more common. We know relatively little about the people who lived in Britain centuries before the Romans arrived. The Bronze Age sites we do have typically aren't well preserved. Rather than wooden posts, there's just evidence of places where those posts would have been. Archaeologists described finding a couple of shards of pottery or a pit with animal bones as getting really lucky. So the discovery of the Pompeii of the Fens was exceptional. This was the sort of discovery that enabled experts to learn more about this important era in British history, but also proposed new questions that we still can't answer. One of the biggest questions that we have about the Pompeii of the Fens was why it was destroyed. Archaeologists were able to determine that it had only been built 9 months to a year previously. There was a lack of occupational waste which would have been present if the site had been settled for a long time. The wood that was being used to build the structure was also described as green when it was burned, meaning it had only recently been cut down. There was also a lack of burrowing insects in the woods, which would have taken a long time to make their homes in the logs, especially considering the environment of the Fens. So if it had only been built for less than a year, how or why was it destroyed? Experts believe it was unlikely that it was an accidental fire. There would have been hearths in each of the round houses, likely in the center, with easy access to an opening to let out smoke. But these people would have been used to living in wood houses, so they knew how to have hearths operating without leading to a disaster. It also seems unlikely that something like this would have been able to rip through the entire settlement so quickly that people weren't able to stop it or even collect belongings. We know the fire happened quickly. Food was found still in pots being cooked, and one bowl filled with a porridge-like food still had a wooden spoon inside. This sudden abandonment is one of the reasons why the settlement earned its Pompeii nickname. It truly was a single moment in time, captured and preserved for thousands of years. All of the humans in the settlement managed to escape, but they left behind lambs, which would have been particularly valuable. The remains of dogs were also located. The only human remains found at the site was a female skull, but it's believed this had been from someone who passed away long before the fire. It may have been an ancestor and a keepsake belonging to one of the inhabitants. This sort of artifact would have been irreplaceable, and it would have been one of the things the owner would have wanted to save if possible. For this reason, it seems unlikely this was a deliberate fire set by the settlers. There are incidents in other ancient settlements of houses being burned down by the owners and later rebuilt, but that wasn't the case here. One theory is that the settlement was deliberately destroyed by attackers. The palisade built around the settlement and the hordes of weapons that were located inside seem to suggest that the people were, at the very least, trying to keep someone or something outside of the settlement. This might have been why it was built over water in the first place, to make it even harder for attackers to get through. This could be a sign that the settlement was built in hostile territory, though we know that the settlers would have traded with and interacted with the outside world. As well as beads from the continent, some of the meat found at the site belonged to animals that didn't live in the Finn area. Just how much the people of Must Farm interacted with other locals is another mystery. If the settlement was deliberately destroyed by attackers, this could explain why it was never resettled. There's no evidence of any recovery efforts taking place or any other settlement being built in this area. This wasn't the first time something had been built over the river here. Archaeologists found evidence of even more ancient sites that were already destroyed and rotting by the time the Must Farm settlers began to build. But the site seems to have been completely abandoned. That could be because the settlers decided it was too dangerous to stay in this area, or because whoever set the fire to the settlement wouldn't allow them to return. A forensic fire investigator was brought to the scene to see if the mystery of how the fire was started could be solved. The investigator believed it was possible that the fire had been deliberately set, but there was nothing to say for certain that this was the answer. It's possible that evidence for the attack might have been found in one of the round houses that were destroyed before archaeologists took over the site. Despite this mystery, the site provided a fascinating insight into the Bronze Age Britain, and might someday help to answer more questions about what life was like 3,000 years ago. Throughout human history, there are instances of myths and legends being attached to historical figures. Sometimes these can obscure the truth, but eventually, archaeologists and historians are able to get to the bottom of reality. But that isn't always the case. The story of Queen Samiris of Assyria is one such case where the legends and myths still shroud the true history. It wasn't until generations later that the story of Samiris was told, and the most complete version of her story comes from Greek historians. In the legendary story, Samiris was the daughter of a fish goddess and immortal. After she was born, her mother disappeared to the bottom of the lake, and Samiris was abandoned. The child was found by doves who stole milk from a local shepherd family and looked after the infant. An abandoned child being looked after by animals is a trope that appears often in mythologies from this region, but doves were a unique element to Samiris' story. She was eventually found by the royal shepherd who raised her. Samiris was described as having a divine beauty as well as great intelligence. She was later married to one of the king's advisors, a man named Anis. The king in this tale is Ninus of Assyria. According to Greek historians, Ninus was the founder of Nineveh, who conquered what is today the Middle East. It was on one of his campaigns that Samiris caught his attention. Ninus sought advice from Anis, who revealed that many of his strategies had actually come from his wife. With Samiris' help, Ninus was victorious. He wished to marry Samiris and offered Anis his own daughter as a trade. Anis didn't want to let her go, but Ninus threatened to destroy him, and he relented. Samiris became Ninus' queen and continued to aid his conquests. They had a son together, Ninus, but he was still young when Ninus passed away. Samiris then took control of the empire, leading many campaigns. Some versions of the story have her pretending to be her own son in order to gain the support of the nobles and the army, while in other versions she simply ruled in her own right. Samiris was an even more fearsome ruler than her husband, and she spread the empire further east into Asia, as well as taking Egypt and going as far south as Ethiopia. When it came to India, she had fake elephants constructed to try to scare the Indian armies. But when it came time to do battle, Samiris was severely wounded and had to retreat. She managed to escape, cutting the bridge behind her to stop the advancing army. While on her travels, she sought advice from the Oracle of Ammon, who told her that her own son would be her undoing. That would come true after the campaign across the Indus. Ninus was now an adult, and he plotted to take the throne back. After ruling for 42 years, Samiris abdicated in favor of her son, and her story ended with her disappearing into obscurity. She would later be associated with various gods, and later versions of the story claimed she even invented polytheism. Samiris would also later be associated with the biblical Nimrod and the construction of the Tower of Babel. Samiris was said to have embarked on many construction projects during her reign. The ancient works across from Turkey to the Indus Valley have been associated with her. The truth of Samiris is much less fantastical and unfortunately less clear. Samiris was born around 850 BC. We don't know where she was born, but it was likely somewhere around the Levant or in Assyria itself. Later scholars claim that she'd been a Babylonian princess or from some more distant location. She would eventually meet and marry the Neo-Assyrian king Shamshi-Adad V and became his chief wife. Shamshi-Adad V ruled from 824 to 811, and unfortunately very little survives about Samiris during his reign. It wasn't until after he passed away that she became more prominent. When Shamshi-Adad passed, his son, Adad-Nirari III, was still very young. This was a period of great political turmoil. While Shamshi-Adad's conquests were nowhere near the legendary campaigns of Ninus, he'd spent much of his rule out on military campaigns. His rule had even started with a revolt against the previous king, and it's likely that there was a fear something similar might happen with a young king on the throne. Samiris took over ruling in her son's stead. Unfortunately, records of what she did during this time have been lost. Historians aren't even clear what her official role was. There's debate over whether she co-ruled with the young king, or if she simply ruled in his place. It's believed she continued to use the title of queen rather than queen regent, and inscriptions seem to indicate that she became more prominent during this period than during her time actually being married to the king. She may also have gone on military campaigns with her son. Adad-Nirari took over and began ruling in his own right in 808 BC. That would mean that whatever Samiris' reign actually looked like, it only lasted for about 3 years rather than the 42 of legend. Like in the legendary version of this story, the end of Samiris' story is unknown. She appears to have faded out of public life and passed into obscurity. There are many parts of Samiris' story that remain a mystery. With our current archaeological findings, it's impossible to tell what parts of the Samiris story were inspired by real events, and which were completely fictitious. Given the number of stories about legendary heroes being raised by animals, it's easy to see that as a later invention. But the story of Samiris being the wife of an advisor before meeting the king could be inspired by real events. As Samiris appears to have gone on campaign with her son, she may have had some military abilities like in the legend. It could also be that she had nothing to do with her army's achievements during her short reign. The associations between Samiris and divinity make some sense. In an era where a woman having such authority would have been very rare, the only powerful women people would know of would be goddesses. The Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar would be fitting, as she was a goddess of both love and war. Using this, it would be possible to argue that Samiris was able to be successful because she was divine in some way. Unfortunately, for now, this is all simply speculation, but it seems reasonable to assume that Samiris was special in some way, to have inspired stories and legends hundreds of years after she fell from power. Typically, when someone goes missing, investigators are able to find a few clues in or around the area that they went missing, such as signs of a struggle, receipts from a store that they visited, or security footage from CCTV cameras in the area. But some disappearances seem to defy explanation. Their friends and family find that it's impossible to contact them because their phone is turned off or the battery has died. They leave no clue as to where they may have gone, and they're never seen or heard from again. While these types of cases are unusual and by no means commonplace, the 1975 disappearance of a woman named Martha Wright from the Lincoln Tunnel, which connects New Jersey to Manhattan in New York, is even more unusual, since she seemed to vanish into thin air in a matter of seconds, and the case remains unsolved today. Very little information is available on Martha and her disappearance, but what we do know is that she was with her husband, Jackson Wright, when it occurred. The couple was traveling in their car from New Jersey to New York City, and it had started raining. At one point, they needed to drive through the Lincoln Tunnel, a trip that they no doubt had made several times before. But on this occasion, things would turn out very differently than they usually did. They were the only car on the road, and as they passed through the tunnel, condensation had started collecting on the car's front and back windshields. They had no choice but to pull over, and Jackson was finding it hard to see and driving had become dangerous. He stopped the car by the side of the road and got out to wipe the windshield down, while Martha walked to the back of the car to do the same. It took just a short while for Jackson to finish his part of the chore, and when he was done, he looked up to see if he could help Martha with the other windshield. When he did so, he couldn't see her, and so he walked around the car to see what she was doing, but she was nowhere to be found. He was completely baffled since there were no other cars in the tunnel, and since there was nowhere that she could have walked off to. She hadn't been struck by a passing car. She couldn't have left the tunnel on foot in the time it took Jackson to clean the front windshield, and she certainly hadn't been kidnapped. She simply vanished off the face of the earth in the span of just a few seconds. Jackson contacted the police and a thorough investigation was launched, but no trace of Martha was ever found, and the case has never been solved. Due to the lack of information on the case and seemingly impossible circumstances surrounding it, many people have questioned whether it really happened, and if it did, whether Jackson may have had something to do with Martha's disappearance. But we simply don't know, and it's a case that will likely never be solved. On the 21st of December, 1964, an unusual event took place near Fishersville, West Virginia, when a man named Horace Burns, a gunsmith, was traveling to the area from Staunton along Route 250. He noticed that the area was unusually quiet, which must have been disheartening when his car's engine suddenly started acting up near the Woodrow Wilson Center. He knew that if the engine stopped, he would have no choice but to get out of the car and either fix it himself or find someone to help him, which would not be easy since there didn't seem to be anyone else around. Then, as he approached the Woodrow Wilson Center, he noticed something in the sky ahead of him that he'd never seen before. A strange metallic object was moving through the sky heading north, and as it passed over his car, the engine finally stopped. He would later tell investigators that it didn't roll to a stop as one would expect, but it stopped very suddenly, as if being controlled remotely. But what happened next perplexed him even more. As he watched the strange object pass by, it suddenly slowed down and started descending, eventually landing in a field about 100 yards from where he was standing. He then managed to get a good look at it, and later described its appearance as similar to a spinning top, only upside down. He also noted that it had no landing gear, doors, or windows. It was about 125 feet wide and 90 feet high, and a strange blue light was emitting from underneath. He could do nothing but watch as the craft sat in the field for about a minute to 90 seconds, and in this time it just sat there silently. But then it suddenly emitted what he described as a loud whooshing sound before it accelerated directly upward, something that he felt should not have been possible. He could hardly believe what he had just seen, and when he got home, he told his wife of the inexplicable event. They decided that it would probably be better if he just kept it to himself, since he would likely have been subjected to a lot of ridicule. But when they learned of the existence of a UFO club at the Eastern Mennonite College, he decided to contact them. He gave his account of what he had seen, and together with the professor from the college, he returned to the landing site to investigate. A Geiger counter that belonged to the professor gave some astounding readings of more than 60,000 counts per minute, and they decided to report it to investigators from the famous Blue Book Project. When investigators from the project traveled to the area, they found that the military was already conducting an investigation. It's then that they learned of even more sightings, seemingly of the same object. A 14-year-old boy reported that he'd seen the object about 20 minutes before Burns did. He spotted it when he looked out of his bedroom window and described it as cigar-shaped. At first, his family told him to keep it to himself, but when they learned of Burns' account, they decided to come forward. In an effort to explain the discrepancies in the object's shape, he stated that he may have seen it from a different angle, and hence it appeared to be cigar-shaped rather than a spinning top. He added that he had never seen any airplanes move as fast as the object did, and he found it strange that it didn't have any wings, landing gear, or a tail. In the months that followed, many more people in the area reported strange sightings of objects in the sky, and no official explanation has ever been given, leading many people to believe that it was an extraterrestrial craft that landed in Fishersville that afternoon. In July of 1907, King Edward VII was set to visit Dublin, Ireland. He was set to conduct a ceremony during which Lord Castletown would be sworn in as a new knight of the Order of St. Patrick. For this to be done, he would have to use the crown jewels of Ireland, which at the time were being kept in the Bedford Tower, under the watchful eye of Sir Arthur Vickers, who was the Ulster King of Arms. But on the 6th of July, to their dismay, they found that the crown jewels were missing, which seemed impossible since Dublin was inundated with members of the military and police officers, none of whom had spotted the culprit that stole the precious jewels. The jewels are described as having a star in the middle, which is decorated with diamonds, an emerald and ruby cross. It also has a diamond badge and 5 gold collars that are also decorated with diamonds. All in all, it contains a total of 394 jewels, and it's worth millions of dollars. They would have been very hard to get to, since they were being kept in a strong room along with a few weapons and some important documents. To get to the strong room, you would need to have a key, but the only 2 that existed were kept by Sir Arthur Vickers. It isn't certain exactly when the jewels were taken, since nearly a month had passed since they were last seen in the safe, and there had been a few security issues during that time when the safe's doors were found standing open. Strangely, nothing was done on those occasions, but even more bizarrely, it seemed as though the robbers wanted to draw attention to their crime, since they left a ribbon and a clasp behind, though some people think they may have intended to return for those. With no leads to follow up on, a reward of £1,000 was offered to anyone with information leading to the jewels being found. And soon, even psychics were claiming to have had visions of where they'd been taken. This led to a lot of wasted time and efforts as graveyards were dug up. Many different areas were searched, and countless leads were followed, all to no avail. Sir Arthur Vickers was the first to feel the fallout of the robbery, as he was accused of being lax in his care for the jewels. It then came to light that on one occasion, Vickers had been drinking and was heavily intoxicated. The Viceroy's son, Lord Haddo, decided to play a prank on him, and he stole the safe's keys to open the case, and he removed the jewels. But he did send them back to Vickers by mail shortly after, but this should have never happened. The first suspect to be named was the brother of the well-known explorer, Ernest Shackleton. Francis Shackleton was known to have been struggling financially at the time, and he was one of the people that may have had access to the safe keys. But he was able to prove that he was abroad at the time of the robbery, but many people feel that he'd ordered someone else to carry out the crime, since the safe's lock was found to be intact, suggesting that someone familiar with the building had acquired a key. Many other people were accused, but the authorities were grabbing at straws in an effort to pin the crime on a scapegoat, and the culprits were never identified. Vickers was relieved of his post, and despite a thorough investigation being carried out, the jewels were never found and still remain missing today. In 1352, Thibaut de Castillon was serving as the Bishop of Lisbon in Portugal. Here, he tried his hand at overseas trade, and soon amassed a considerable fortune. But the bishop didn't always play by the rules, and it's been found that he was involved in corrupt transactions. This was known to Pope Innocent VI, but he seemingly turned a blind eye since he took no action against him. This resulted in de Castillon becoming a very rich man, but before long, he'd fallen gravely ill. He passed away on the 28th of May, 1356, and a new bishop was immediately appointed. There was now the matter of deciding what would become of de Castillon's riches. It consisted of more than 18,000 pounds of silver and gold, along with many valuable documents and more than 20 horses and mules. 8,000 pounds of silver and gold would eventually be used to repair the cathedral after it was damaged during an earthquake, though most of that sum was spent on matters involving extortion. But once all of that was dealt with, the rest of the estate was sent to Avignon in France, specifically to the Pope's residence. The transfer was entrusted to the Pope's executor, who boarded a ship called the São Vicente for the journey to France. But when it reached the coast of Cartagena in Spain, the ship was beset by pirates. But they wouldn't get away with their ill-gotten gains for long. The pirates' galley encountered bad weather, and it ran aground near Mugello, France. The ship was lost, and the treasure aboard sank beneath the water with it. But before long, pieces of the treasure started washing ashore, and royal notaries started collecting the pieces, claiming that they belonged to the Pope, and that they needed to be returned to him. The pirates responsible for the robbery were arrested, and while many were executed, those with higher ranks were sent to prison. Much of the treasure was recovered, but a substantial portion of it remained missing, as it still does today. It's said that much of the missing loot was picked up by locals, or that it simply is still lying at the bottom of the ocean, but there have been speculations that it was all recovered and secretly added to the Pope's growing coffers. This seems unlikely though, since the treasure would likely have spread on the sea floor, and it would have been virtually impossible to retrieve all of it. It remains unknown today what became of the rest of the treasure, and perhaps in the future, someone will be lucky enough to stumble across it. We've all come across reports of people who have seen strange lights in the sky, and very often these are thought to be extraterrestrial craft, or something equally sinister that we're unable to explain. But not all reports of inexplicable lights involve lights in the sky, as is evidenced by a phenomenon that's said to take place in King William County, Virginia, specifically on a set of train tracks that was once known as the Southern Railroad line. Here you'll find the Cohoe Crossroads, though people who live in the area might discourage you from visiting the site since it's said to be haunted, specifically by that Cohoe light that appears there regularly. People have reported that on some misty and murky nights, a strange orange light appears on the tracks, and many witnesses have described seeing it swaying gently from side to side, but on other occasions it's been observed holding steady and growing larger, as if it were the lights of a fast-approaching train. There have been countless efforts made to explain this strange event, but none have adequately clarified what causes it. Hence, there are many theories as to what it could be, but two are mentioned more often than the rest. He first mentions an incident that's said to have taken place during the 1800s. On one occasion, a train had stopped at the crossroads to be inspected by a brakeman. He would check the train for any problems with his lantern in hand, and if he found any issues, he would inform the train's engineer. But on this night, things wouldn't go to plan. The brakeman spotted an issue with a set of couplers between two of the train's cars. He decided to use his lantern to take a closer look, but as he did so, the train shuddered forward, ending the brakeman's life. It's said that the accident resulted in the man losing his head, and that the Cohoe light is the light from his lantern that can be seen swaying to and fro while he searches for it. But there is a second theory. Locals tell a tale of a Civil War train that passed through the area, and that it had Confederate soldiers aboard who'd been injured in battle. They were taken from Richmond to West Point, where they reached their destination as the train was attacked by Union soldiers. It's said that all of the soldiers aboard lost their lives, and that the train that's seen emitting the eerie orange light is that very same train that still contains the spirits of all those fallen soldiers still heading to West Point. Then there are those that feel that the light has some kind of extraterrestrial origin, since it's been seen changing shape and color without explanation. During one incident, a group of 5 friends was near the crossroads when they noticed the light shining as bright as the light from a welder. As they watched, the light disappeared and reappeared multiple times while changing from orange to red and back again. It also changed shape, and so they don't believe it was either a lantern or a train's headlight. While more mundane explanations have been offered, including that the light is caused by swamp gas, which can be very volatile at times, or that it's caused by some strange atmospheric conditions, no solid explanation has ever been found, and the Cohoe light remains an unexplained mystery that may never be solved. During World War II, Antonin T. Horak was serving as a captain in the Slovak uprising of Czechoslovakia. In October of 1944, he and 2 fellow soldiers were doing their best to hide from the enemy, as he and his companions had been wounded, and the group didn't want to be taken prisoner. On the 22nd of October, they stumbled upon a trench and decided to hide out there for the time being. During this time, Horak lost consciousness, and when he came to, he was being dragged through the snow by one of the local villagers. The man stated that his name was Slavek and that he owned the pastures that they were in. He then built a crude stretcher, and for the next 4 hours, the 4 men made their way through the snow until they reached a grotto in the Tatra Mountains. The man told them to go into the grotto, but he seemed to regard the space as almost spiritual as he crossed each of them, himself and the grotto. It's then that Horak noticed a hole in the grotto's back wall. Slavek warned the men not to venture deep into the cave, stating that the grotto is the entrance to a massive underground network that's akin to a maze, and that they could easily get lost. He added that sections of the network contained pockets of poisonous gases, and that there had been multiple sightings of spirits in the caves. But the three men were more concerned with their own survival, and when Slavek left, they tried to keep as comfortable as possible in the cold conditions by placing hot stones around themselves. They had nothing to eat, but they dared not leave the grotto since enemy soldiers were patrolling the area, and since there had been heavy snowfall, the likelihood of an avalanche occurring was becoming ever more likely. But hunger got the best of Horak, and thinking that he might come across a hibernating animal, he decided to venture further into the cave. He walked for about 90 minutes before the tunnels widened into a passage with another large hole at the end. He decided to crawl through it, and when he emerged on the other side, he was dumbstruck by what he saw. At first, he thought he'd stumbled across a naturally formed wall of black salt, or lava, but he soon realized that the structure seemed man-made. He described the object as a large circular stone that took up most of the space in the chamber, and that seemed to be made of a polished metal, though when he ran his hand over it, it felt like stone. He then noticed a large crack along the length of the strange object, but when he looked inside, he could only see darkness. He then realized that there was a crescent-shaped object imprinted on the wall outside the chamber, and he felt that this was part of the larger object that he had seen. He struck the object with one of the tools that he was carrying, and was surprised when it gave off a green spark. The sound of it being struck was louder than it should have been, as it continued to echo for some time afterward. He made a note of the object's location since he thought it might be valuable, and he could return later to retrieve it. But after the war, he immigrated to the US and never managed to raise the funds to return to the area before he passed away in 1975. But he had told many people about what he saw, and many attempts have been made to locate the object again, but the local government has refused to allow anyone to explore the area, leading many people to believe that it was part of an extraterrestrial craft that had crashed into the mountains and was being kept secret from the public. Though officials claim that the area is not to be explored since it's dangerous to do so, many people believe there is more to the story, and that Horak came across something that's not of this world. Dunvegan Castle is situated on the Isle of Skye in Scotland, and it's here where a strange flag belonging to the MacLeod clan is kept. It's known as the Fairy Flag and is said to possess some very weird powers. The clan believed the flag to be magical and that its unfurling would guarantee them victory over an enemy, but it could only be used in this manner 3 times. It's been used twice so far. The first incident took place in 1490, when the MacLeods were engaged in a fierce battle with the MacDonald clan. The battle was not going well, and they'd lost a lot of men, but then the flag was unfurled and everything changed. The MacLeods were able to turn the battle on its head, and they walked away victorious, much to the disbelief of their enemy, who was on the brink of victory before the flag was revealed and its legend started to grow. The next incident took place in 1520, during another battle between the same 2 clans. This time, as before, the MacLeods were hopelessly outnumbered, and their enemy was assured the victory. That is, until the fairy flag was brought out. As soon as it was unfurled, the tide of the battle turned once again, and the MacLeods romped to victory against all odds, seemingly thanks to the flag they were carrying. The flag was now seen as legendary, but its origins are steeped in mystery, as there are 3 different versions of how the MacLeods acquired it. One tale states that one of the clan's ancestors was fighting in a crusade when he was taken in by a hermit who warned him to stay away from a nearby mountain pass, since it was guarded by an entity called the Daughter of Thunder, who would swiftly do away with any true believers. But he wasn't about to be intimidated, and he tracked the entity down. They fought fiercely, but it was defeated, and it then asked MacLeod to take its girdle and spear to fashion the legendary flag along with a staff. Another claim states that there was once a great feast at the Dunvegan Castle, and that the clan's chief ordered that his infant son be taken to his room. There he became cold, and a fairy entered his room to cover him with a shawl. The following day, the child was brought into the main hall, still wrapped in the shawl, and as he was carried in, those in attendance could hear the strange sounds of fairies singing a lullaby, and hence it's still called the Fairy Flag to this day. The third tale states that a MacLeod chief had married a fairy, and they lived happily together until the fairy had to return to her own people. When the time came to part ways, they did so at the Fairy Bridge, and here she gave the flag to her husband, informing him that it could be used to win any battle, but only 3 times. The flag is also said to have the power to cure diseases in cattle, improving fishing hauls in the Dunvegan Loch, and that it can increase fertility in humans. It's also said that when the flag is unfurled for the third and last time, it'll spell the end of the MacLeods forever, or that it'll be confiscated for good by an invisible entity. The flag remains shrouded in mystery, and its legend is one that will live on for many more years. Uncovering history as an archaeologist is hard, but often very rewarding work. And through the years, some very interesting and sometimes inexplicable artifacts have been uncovered that have left experts baffled. Some of these relics are found in areas where they shouldn't exist, or they contain materials that weren't available at the time, making their existence all the more perplexing. And in many of these cases, these mysteries have never been solved. But not all of these types of mysteries are found underground. One tapestry, known as Summer's Triumph Tapestry, is known to have been created in 1538 in Belgium, and it too contains some very interesting and perplexing imagery. The images are meant to depict a ruler's ascension to power, and the joy that the summer season brings. But there are a few images that have left historians and experts baffled, since they show something that shouldn't be there. In the top left-hand corner, a number of strange objects can be seen. They're described as being hat or saucer-shaped, leading many people to speculate that the tapestry's creator had at some point in their life had interactions with extraterrestrials or their craft. The images have been compared to other religious depictions of the same medieval era, but none show these eerie objects in the sky. It's been suggested that these objects were purposefully included in the tapestry to create the impression that the reigning authorities were somehow connected to extraterrestrials, and were therefore seen as superior. It could also be the case that these objects would have been associated with the new ruler, and that he would then be seen as divine and all-powerful by the people who served under him. But for now, this remains mere speculation. Since people of this period may have seen strange objects in the sky, and instantly associated them with the heavens, it may be that these sightings were included in the tapestry as a tribute to the divine, or used as a suggestion that these divine beings were their allies. But this is not the only historical artwork that contains references to flying objects. In a painting from 1350 which depicts the crucifixion of Christ, two strange flying objects can be seen in the two top corners, and they've yet to be explained. The painting The Baptism of Christ was created in 1710 and shows a disc-shaped object in the sky, and it can be seen sending beams of light down toward the ground. Many people believe that this is an extraterrestrial craft that was seen at the event, and hence included in the painting. Today, the Summer's Triumph Tapestry is being kept at the Bayerische National Museum in Germany. Nothing further is known about these strange objects, and it's unlikely that we'll ever find any definitive answers to this mystery. If you were to visit Ohio University, you may be surprised to learn that there's one particular room in Wilson Hall that you'd be forbidden from entering. While you may think that it's because sensitive documents are being kept there, or because it's used as a storage area, the truth is far less mundane, as it's actually said to be extremely haunted. According to legend, the campus is located between 5 ancient cemeteries that form a pentagram under the building, and the room, number 428, is said to have seen some very strange events over the years. The first incident took place in the 1970s, when a male student at the campus lost his life in the room under strange and unusual circumstances, though those circumstances have not been elaborated on. Students who stayed in the room following this event reported hearing strange sounds during the night, including disembodied footsteps that they were unable to locate or explain. Then there are claims that a female student once lived in the room, and here she realized that the room had a strange energy that she could use to her own benefit. She managed to astral travel and carried out several other types of rituals, including attempts to make contact with the departed and other occult rituals, until she also lost her life in the room in what's been described as a violent manner, though further details aren't available. Ever since, the room has been said to be completely inhospitable. Students who stayed there after the fact reported seeing objects flying off of shelves without explanation, and that they always had an unnerving feeling as if they weren't alone or were being watched. On other occasions, objects would smash to pieces against the walls, and some students reported hearing whispering that sometimes turned into talking, and eventually full-blooded screaming, leaving them terrified and unwilling to stay there any longer. Then there were reports of the door opening and then slamming shut on its own, as if it was being moved by an unseen hand. Others stated that they kept seeing demonic faces that appeared in the door's grain, and in an effort to put their minds at ease, the door was replaced on several occasions, only for the faces to return again. The room had grown to legendary status for the strange occurrences that took place there, and students as well as faculty members became convinced that spirits and possibly demons dwell inside. In the early 1980s, a local newspaper got wind of these claims and decided to conduct an investigation into the origins of the building, and what they found was very interesting, to say the least. It was discovered that Wilson Hall was built on the same site as a cemetery that once belonged to the Athens Mental Institute, and many people believe that it's the tortured souls of former patients that still linger there, though this doesn't explain why the strange activity seems to be centered on that specific room. Eventually, faculty members at the university decided that the room had gained a notorious reputation, and it was sealed off for good to keep anyone from entering and encountering one of these entities. They were also fearful that the room may result in yet another student losing their life, and now no one is allowed to enter it under any circumstances. But this has only contributed to the room's ghoulish reputation, and its legend will live on for as long as it exists. In March of 1978, 44-year-old Joyce Kennedy was working as a ticket agent for the SeaTac Airport in Seattle, Washington. But no one could have envisioned that she would suddenly go missing, and that her disappearance would still be unsolved almost half a century later. The morning of the 10th of March of that year was no different for Joyce. She got up that morning, got dressed for work, and had breakfast before setting out for her shift at the airport, just as she had done many times before. Her day at work was unremarkable, and when her shift was over later that afternoon, she was seen by several witnesses leaving her counter, after which they assumed she'd gotten in her car and driven home, as she would any other day. But this day was different. Something had happened to Joyce, and to this day, no one knows what occurred. She didn't show up for her shift the following morning, which was seen as very out of character. And when airline officials were unable to contact her or find her, they decided to report her as missing. A search was immediately conducted, but since no one had any idea where she may have gone before disappearing, no clues were found until 2 days later, when her car was found parked in the visitors section of the airport's parking lot, rather than the usual spot she used in the staff parking lot. Investigators found that all the doors were left unlocked, and surprisingly, her keys and purse were found inside on the front seat, though it isn't specified whether they were located on the driver's or passenger side. They found no evidence that Joyce had been a victim of foul play, and they were at a loss as to what may have happened to her. The resulting investigation found that she was supposed to meet her ex-husband, John Thomas O'Keefe II, that evening, as he was supposed to repay an undisclosed amount of money that he'd borrowed from her. The couple hadn't had the happiest of marriages, as Joyce stated that O'Keefe had been abusive, and they eventually divorced in 1976. Joyce had spoken to her brother and asked if he could accompany her to the meeting since she was afraid of him, but her brother told her that he had other plans. Witnesses stated that she was last seen wearing a red blouse, tan pants, a gold ring with the word love engraved on it, and, as usual, her glasses. They described her as a gentle soul who was dedicated to her work and who always served passengers warmly with a smile. Joyce's family immediately suspected that her ex-husband was somehow involved in her disappearance, likely because he didn't want to repay the money that was owed to her, but no evidence was ever found to implicate him, and he was never charged for a crime. They feel that he did meet with her that evening, and something untoward took place, possibly costing her her life. They speculate that he then drove her car back to the airport, and unable to enter the staff parking lot, decided to leave it unlocked in the visitors area with her possessions on the front seat. They think this was an attempt to make it look like she decided to vanish of her own accord, but they were never able to prove it, and since he's passed away, it's unlikely that the mystery of Joyce's disappearance will ever be solved. Prague, the capital city of the Czech Republic, not only reflects a rich heritage, but also uncertain and ghostly historical happenings. The ghost stories begin at Kingsky Palace. The building was being built in Old Town Square, but the regulations weren't being followed. Builders had built against zoning laws by setting it a bit more forward than it should have been. No one noticed until it was completed in 1765. While some preparations were still being made inside the building, an elderly man had tripped and fallen, after which he would be subjected to a startling discovery. He told the builders that they shouldn't have built as far out as they had because the devil owned the ground underneath it. After this encounter, the foundation would begin to crack, continuing for 4 more days. The workers then went looking for the man, thinking he might have some answers. He told them the same thing. What lay beneath the palace was owned by the devil. According to him, the building would not be left to stand there. One builder asked if there was a way to correct the situation, but the price was far too heavy to pay. It demanded a sacrifice. According to the legend, the builders had gone through with it, but not without consequence. The ghost of the victim would soon haunt the building. The first inhabitants moved into the building only to sell it rather quickly afterward and move out. A new owner moved in and reported hearing haunting cries in the night and the patter-patter of feet running down the halls. He too sold the building and looked for a new place to live. Prague Castle is no exception to the ghostly inhabitants. Stories arose in early times, such as those of a water sprite who'd been disappearing into the walls when followed. Charles IV was also seen running around the castle. Some peculiar specters stopped Protestants from ringing the church bells at the wrong time. There's another story of a white apparition that haunts the cathedral. The legend states that a man had gone to the cathedral in an intoxicated state. When he awoke, he was met with a white entity that warned him never to come back. In 1753, the ghost returned again. This time, a guard had been doing his rounds when the lights in the cathedral had mysteriously turned on and the organ began to play. The guard cautiously approached the door, only to see a white figure step out. The guard ordered the being to state its name, but he merely looked at him before throwing wheat at his feet and disappearing back inside. The guard decided to follow after him, but found no one inside. The following night, another guard faced the same ordeal. This time, gold coins were thrown to his feet instead of wheat. On the third night, the same thing happened, except this time, the on-duty individual got so frightened that he fired at the entity. The being managed to catch the slug and threw it to the ground before proclaiming that in the years that followed, the people would be blessed with generous crops. The year after that, they would be showered with luck and gains. But in the third year, there would be war. The being wasn't wrong. In the third year, a 7-year war began. One of the more feared ghosts is that of a French major who haunted the fortress of Vyšehrad. He's said to be among the more terrifying entities that haunt the city of Prague. He was the commander of the French troops that invaded the area in 1741 during the War of the Austrian Succession, which coincidentally lasted 7 years. Mauro de Mauro was awarded the nickname of the Inconvenient Journalist. He was born in Foggia in 1921, and after the Second World War, he moved to Palermo as a supporter of Benito Mussolini's regime. It was there that he would devote himself to journalism, becoming an extraordinary reporter for different newspapers. One of the stories he covered was of Enrico Mattei, the president of the ENI oil company. In 1970, he was dealing with this exact case again. This time, it was on behalf of Francesco Rossi for the film The Mattei Affair, released 2 years later. He also did some investigative pieces on Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian Mafia. He was also the first person to release a map of the Mafia, which was confirmed to be true a whole 22 years later. On the 16th of September in 1970, 49-year-old De Mauro was en route home at around 9 p.m. Franca, his daughter, had seen him speaking to some men outside, after which he would climb back into his BMW and leave. The vehicle was eventually located, but there was no sign of the journalist anywhere. There exist a few conflicting conclusions, none of which have ever been confirmed. One of the conclusions came years after the initial vanishing. Mafia members who were turned state witnesses explained that the journalist met his demise by the order of the Sicilian Mafia. Yet another story speaks of a coup carried out by someone known as the Black Prince, who the journalist regarded as the commander of Decima Mas, an Italian Navy force. For more than 50 years, the case of Mauro de Mauro has been left a mystery. There's been no body, no clues, and no certainty as to who is responsible. There have been various investigations into the Mafia, as a connection was trying to be established between them and the vanishing, but no ties to the case ever came about. In terms of journalism, there exist a few investigative tracks. The most talked about one being that the journalist was investigating the passing of Enrico Mattei, who'd been involved in a suspicious aircraft accident. Another path speaks of the revelations that Damaro may have made about the Borghese coup. The coup was attempted 2 months after the disappearance. Additionally, the trial history has reported on misdirection and tampering of evidence. It highlights behind-the-scenes movements of organized crime, secret services, and obscure powers. The case is regarded as a kidnapping, possibly because of the allegations that the former mafia members have made, but it's noted that Franca had seen her father get into his own car and leave. There's no statement as to whether or not he was followed, or if any of the men he was speaking to had gotten into the car with him. In 2005, the investigation itself concluded, yet remains an unsolved mystery. In the years that followed, the leader of the Sicilian Mafia was under investigation for the kidnapping of the man, but he was acquitted of this charge in 2011. There was insufficient evidence on Toto Riina, so he could not be solidly connected to the case. The disappearance of Mauro De Maro has since been an ongoing historical mystery that may never be solved. UFOs and alien mysteries have long plagued our existence, but the first reports of such a sighting came earlier than we would have thought. How do we know of this report? Well, it was recorded in the diary of a well-known figure in England. John Winthrop was born in 1588 in Edwardstone, Suffolk, England. He became the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and was also a leading figure among the Puritan founders of New England. On the 1st of March in 1639, he opened his diary and recorded the triumphs and trials that he had faced. But a few pages back, he detailed something far beyond our imagination. He explained that James Everell had been rowing a boat along with 2 others in the muddy river. The river flowed through a swampland, emptying into the Charles River. While they were rowing, the men saw an incredible light in the sky. It was standing still and then flamed spontaneously. The governor wrote that it was about 3 square yards, and when it did move, it took the shape of a swine. For 2 to 3 hours, the boatmen reported that the light would run as swiftly as an arrow. It darted between them and Charlestown, a 2 miles distance. Winthrop added that many other credible witnesses had also seen the light in the same area. When the apparition finally subsided, the Puritans found themselves 1 mile upstream. They had no recollection of rowing that far, and it appeared as though the light had transported them. Jack Valley and Chris Aubeck explained in Wonders in the Sky, Unexplained Aerial Objects from Antiquity and Modern Times, that the repositioning of the vessel suggests that the men were unaware during part of the experience. Researchers today may conclude that this was an alien abduction of sorts. Some believe that the glow may have been an ignis fatuus, which is a light that appears over marshland during the evening and is the result of the combustion of gas. But according to the report made by Winthrop, the light had not risen from the swamp, but was darting back and forth across the sky. This made the ignis fatuus explanation seem unlikely. This wasn't the last time the light appeared either. 5 years later, dated in Winthrop's diary as the 18th of January in 1644, was an entry detailing an occurrence in Boston. It was midnight when 3 men were in a boat heading for Boston when they saw 2 lights emerge from the waters near the north point of the cove. From the cove, the lights went to the town a short distance away, and then to the south point before completely vanishing. It was also written there that the lights took the form of a man. One would think that this is where the strange events would end, but it happened again no less than a week later. It was at the Boston harbor that a light, bright like the moon, had risen. The ball split in 2 and then closed and parted again many times after. Eventually, it traveled over the hill on an island and disappeared. As it glided, it projected flames and occasionally sparked. This account was seen by many throughout the town. It had been around 8 p.m. when the light appeared, but accompanying it was a voice that was heard upon the waters that flowed between Dorchester and Boston. The voice shifted from place to place at least 20 times, and 14 days later it returned. The voice spoke in a dreadful manner and was even heard by people on the other side of town. Unlike the previous unexplained happenings, this one seemed to have a story. Winthrop detailed that the event had been seen close to a location where a vessel had erupted. It was captained by John Chaddock, who was not on board at the time. It was said that one of the sailors had accidentally caused the ignition. The crew members were recovered by rescuers, except for one, the man who's said to have been responsible for the disaster. Winthrop believed that the devil was possessing the man and using his haunting voice to scare the people of Boston. The encounters detailed in the governor's diary continue to mystify historians. Were these the first UFO encounters, or is there a more scientific explanation for the events that took place? Frederick MacDonald was an Australian politician back in the 1920s. At first, he was a teacher, but he later rose to prominence, becoming a representative for the Boston Labour Party in 1922. His opposition was Hector Lamond, who was a nationalist member of the Illawarra seat. He was part of the parliament for about 3 years until his narrow defeat in the 1925 election against Thomas Leigh. MacDonald contested the results and even claimed that Leigh had tried to bribe him into quitting and not submitting his nomination papers. The bribe was an offer of £2,000 worth of shares in the King's Cross apartment. He allegedly told the politician that if he pretended to be sick and step out of the election, he could have that share. MacDonald said that he'd strung Leigh along to get solid evidence against him, but he would become suspicious and stopped mentioning any form of bribery. In response to this, the rival declared that MacDonald was a lunatic for the claims and instructed a legal partner to issue a writ of slander. Leigh had won the election, but this didn't stop his rival from trying to prove his deceit. He petitioned the Court of Disputed Returns to have the election results declared void on the grounds of bribery. If he succeeded in proving this, the winner might lose his seat, so he offered a truce, withdrawing the writ, but this was refused. Due to this refusal, the rival then threatened to sue MacDonald, who inevitably backed down when he noticed that he was in financial ruin. On the 15th of April in 1926, the well-known representative was on his way to a meeting with the New South Wales Premier Jack Lang, so that they could plan for the election to be declared void. That morning, he vanished without a trace, along with the attaché case. An extensive search was carried out, but no signs of the man or the briefcase were ever found. Everyone immediately thought that the rival may have had something to do with this untimely disappearance. It was a theory that wasn't entirely unfounded. Many of Leigh's political opponents would often be found coincidentally deceased. It was also found that the rival was convicted of homicide in another case, and was subsequently sent to a psychiatric asylum. But he never revealed anything of MacDonald's enigmatic disappearance, or whether or not he'd been involved. On the 16th of April, a letter signed by Frederick MacDonald would be delivered to Premier Leigh. In the letter, he details that he stood by the accusations he made against Leigh, but also apologizes for leading him on. In the piece, he also said that he must leave, and it seemed he did. His whereabouts to this day remain unknown. The candidate was erased from history. It's uncertain if he took any of his belongings with him, but it's known that he had his briefcase with the proposal inside. No one knows what happened to him, and the entire case remains mysterious. During the 14th and 15th centuries, Prague was undergoing some changes. It was being redeveloped to become one of the grandest of cities. Charles IV's vision was to make this city the jewel of the Roman Empire, and during this time, the old town hall tower was built. In 1410, an astronomical clock was installed by Mikuláš of Kádin, who was approached by the city council, but the legend surrounding the clock doesn't acknowledge him as the artist, but rather Master Hannes. However, the events concerning the clockmaster himself are genuinely horrifying and shrouded in jealousy and spite. Mikuláš of Kádin completed the clock and was later approached by other nations who asked him to build them a magnificent clock as well. But the city councilors got word of this and found Mikuláš, blinding him to ensure that he could never make clocks for another country. He was driven mad by the sudden blindness, and upon his passing, the clock would be cursed. Anyone who tried to fix the clock after that would too be driven mad. An alternative story suggests that the day he was blinded, the creator himself climbed to the tower and stopped the clock. It stayed silent and unmoving for the next 50 to 100 years. In 1490, it was subjected to modification, and again in 1552, 1882, and then it faced burn damage during the Prague Uprising. It wasn't fully restored until 1979. The clock faced various problems after the incident involving its maker, which took decades to repair. It allegedly stopped when the nation was in a state of disaster. It's been referred to as the Eye of the Devil and has been associated with witchcraft. Another legend relates to the skeleton statue, which was added to the construction. It's said that if the clock stops running for a long period, the entirety of the Czech Republic will be faced with suffrage. The statue nods his head in confirmation that the nation would find itself in trying times, according to the historical legend. The figure is said to represent the Grim Reaper and is the oldest part of the clock installation that brings disaster upon the city. 204 Alamo Plaza, San Antonio, Texas. This is the place where a mysterious Texas haunting would take place. Before the 1857 construction of the Menger Hotel, it was a site already rich in history. It had been the very spot where the Battle of the Alamo had come to pass in the late 1830s. A German immigrant named William Menger had arrived in San Antonio in the 1840s, where he would make a name for himself and establish a few breweries. The building that was built upon the battleground was a boarding house owned by Mary Gunther, who went on to marry William. The Mengers would go on to turn the boarding house into the Menger Hotel and hire a local architect to transform it into an elegant two-story creation with some classical details. It was officially opened for business in 1859. William also continued to operate a brewery and even had a large cellar constructed beneath the hotel. A tunnel ran from the cellar to the brewery so that he could bring the guests from the hotel to have a tour of his neighboring business. The building started off as a 50-room hotel, but due to its popularity, it grew to 90 guest rooms, making it the largest hotel in the world. During the Civil War, the building would house the sick and wounded, and some would never leave. It was also subjected to a fire that's believed to have originated in the kitchen. The Menger Hotel today is known as the most haunted hotel in Texas, but just how many ghosts haunt the halls is up for debate. Some place the number of eventful hauntings at 32, while others claim it's much higher. Guests who have visited the historical hotel have reported witnessing strange ghostly phenomena. Beds levitating off the floors and the appearance of translucent faces and mirrors are among the experiences. One of the hauntings is that of Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. He arrived at the hotel in 1898, but it seemed that he and his riders never left. They're referred to as Teddy's Terrors by the locals and are a commonly seen apparition there. Apparently, the ghost appears at the bar during closing hours and has even been heard yelling at workers. One evening, there was a new employee doing the lockup when he spotted the ghostly figure. He immediately panicked and tried to escape, banging and clawing at the door, while Roosevelt just stood there watching him. When he regained composure, he relayed the story, but refused to ever go back into the bar again. During the late 19th century, Sally White, a chambermaid, occupied the hotel and was a beloved staff member. This caused some problems back home with her husband, who was jealous of the attention she received. Unfortunately, this would end Sally's life, according to the legend, and she would pass away on the hotel's 3rd floor. That was over 100 years ago, and her ghost still roams the hotel, doing her duties. She's often seen carrying folded towels or fixing a bedsheet, which seems relatively harmless, but would still be a rather frightening thing to witness. Captain Richard King is another one of the smoky specters that gallivant through the building. He passed away in his private suite on the bed that still has its place in the hotel. Since his 1885 passing, visitors have reportedly felt watched or seen an apparition appear at the end of the bed. Shutters have been seen opening and closing by unseen forces, and there's even been a red orb bouncing across the suite. Throughout the years, many events have occurred at the Menger Hotel, which has only increased the paranormal activity there. In April of 1986, Alan and Deborah Talman, along with their 2 children, made the decision to move into a new house that they thought would be their dream home. Horicon, Wisconsin was described as the city on the marsh, an ideal place to raise a family, as the Talmans believed. Little did they know that they would have to endure an unexpected horror for the months to come. The father had taken up a job offer as a shift supervisor at a manufacturing plant, and he would have to work some rather late shifts that ran into the evening. Hauntings or possessions are often rooted in cursed objects. It can be anything from an antique vase to a vintage doll, or even a Victorian-era painting. Furniture, like a chair or a ghostly wardrobe, may also be on the list. One wouldn't expect what brought on this kind of paranormal activity. Bunk beds seem to be pretty far down the list of possessed objects, but it's this type of furniture that brought about our historical mystery. Initially, the move had been smooth sailing, but things took a turn in February of 1987 when the married couple bought the bunk beds. They'd found the piece at a secondhand shop and assembled it at their home. It would then go into the basement for storage for a few months. When they finally decided to bring it upstairs in May of that year, sure enough, the haunting would commence. At first, whatever spirits were attached to this bed had latched onto a few members, but would later go on to terrorize the whole family. Before anyone had slept in the bed, it was placed in the room next to their son. That evening, the radio on the son's nightstand would begin to change the channel, taking on a life of its own, but his parents wouldn't believe him. A few weeks had gone by, and Alan was painting the basement when he'd gone up for lunch. Before heading upstairs, he placed the paintbrush on the table, but when he returned, he found it inside a bucket with the bristles all sticking up. The daughter had been the one to sleep in the bunk bed and reportedly saw a witch with red eyes behind the bedroom door. She'd even seen a fire ignite in her room. The same thing would be experienced by the son sometime later, and soon a pastor, Wayne DeBratz, would be brought in to assess the situation. Upon entering the house, the pastor felt an immediate evil presence. It's uncertain if he'd attempted to help them, but whether or not he had, the haunting would persist. He also believed that they were the victims of the devil himself. Doors in the house would sporadically slam shut and open again, and the family would hear disembodied voices calling from nowhere. Through some investigations, it was discovered that the house had no history of past hauntings. The events would only begin with the bunk bed, which would later be buried in a landfill, hopefully ridding the world of the possession attached to it. The origins of the bed itself are not known, leaving the whole incident shrouded in mystery. The family would leave the house and it would be put up for sale, and there haven't been any further hauntings in the house since. John Vaudain Creeley became a Philadelphia resident in 1839. He later became a lawyer and a Civil War veteran, and would enter politics as a member of the city council. In 1870, he was elected to Congress and had toppled a powerful Republican member, who was a man destined for greatness, it seemed. That member was Charles O'Neill, who launched a legal challenge in which he proclaimed that he'd been defrauded by the political machine. But Creeley's run as an independent proved rather successful, and on election night, he was serenaded. Creeley seemed bound for a political career, but the wheels began to come off. It appeared that he had very little interest in governing, and instead, he racked up debt and embezzled money. In August of 1872, there was a re-election. Amidst this, the government was being sued for malpractice by a widow, Mary Fearon. She accused him of stealing around $20,000 in stocks and bonds, which she had entrusted to him 1 year prior. She also entrusted 2 insurance policies and the house deed to Creeley. With some adjusted inflation, the governor had embezzled a total of $400,000 to $575,000. He also forged a power of attorney to sell the bonds and transfer the money to himself. He paid off some debts with the help of Mr. Schultz, who was alleged to have been involved in the scam. Then came an unforeseen twist. On the 16th of August in 1872, Creeley would leave his home located at 425 South 15th Street. He told his mother Almeida and his sister Adelaide that he would be heading to Washington and had planned to head to New Orleans after. This had been the last time that John Creeley was seen. Initially, no one seemed to have noticed that he disappeared, aside from his sister and mother, who were searching for him on their own. In Washington, they found that he'd stayed at a hotel for a couple of days. When he left the hotel, he told the clerks about his plans, which were to head to New Orleans, but that day, all his belongings were still left in the hotel room that he occupied. Various attempts were made to contact him, but all of them failed. He was also put on the list in the New Orleans Times-Picayune in 1873 for people who had not collected their mail. Searching the city proved futile, so the two family members moved on to the south and the west, but they didn't find any traces of him there either. For 30 years, the two would search London, Russia, Cuba, Paris, Germany, and Puerto Rico, but the ex-congressman was nowhere to be found. A year after his disappearance, the creditors were looking to collect what Creeley owed them. They began trying to put claims on his house paycheck, but the failed effort would ultimately bring the vanishing to light. In 1927, the Joint Committee on Printing was getting ready to reprint the Biographical Directory of the U.S. Congress. Ansel Wohl and were searching for information on the ex-governor. The committee wrote to the men that Creeley had served in the army, and one of them responded. They said that he was a great soldier and had gone to Washington after being honorably discharged. This was the last that he or anyone had heard from him. He never returned to Philadelphia, the soldier explained, and he had disappeared. Many questions regarding the case of John V. Creeley have been left unanswered. Where did he go? Did he change his name, erasing himself from the rest of history? Why did he leave all of his belongings back at the hotel? Was he kidnapped or did he go into hiding? The man's life was an eventful one, and no one is quite sure where it ended up. The Cresswell Crags refers to a magnificent limestone gorge in England, bordering Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire. There are a number of large caves throughout the gorge, which have been the subject of archaeological excavations ever since the 19th century. Various historical treasures and more alarming finds were discovered in these caves. It's believed that the caves were occupied by humankind in the last ice age, 40,000 to 10,000 years ago, and they may have been inhabited not long before this. When researchers investigated the cave system, they found a number of tools and other artifacts, including some cave etchings depicting human figures, bison, birds, and horses, the regular sort of thing one would expect to find on the walls of a prehistoric cave. Extra markings were also found, but thought to be modern-day graffiti that defaced the site. But this was not the case. The inscriptions were composed of letters, numbers, symbols, and patterns that were carved deeply into the walls. Upon further investigation, it was found that these scribbles were witch marks. The discovery had been made by two enthusiasts, Haley Clark and Ed Waters, who were with the Subterranea Britannica group. They were embarking on a guided tour through the cave system when they noticed the markings. The two determined that they were apotropaic marks, symbols used for averting evil influences or bad luck. Through further research, they were able to determine that the etchings were carved during the 16th and 17th centuries, and were used to protect against witches or evil entities like fairies and other creatures that were feared at the time. The patterns, letters, and spirals are ones that can be found elsewhere in the world, often in churches or at the entrances of historic houses and even on windows or fireplaces. What's strange about this instance is that the cave had been filled with thousands of these markings that adorn the walls and ceilings. It's thought that the locals may have believed that this Cresswell cave system served as an entrance to an evil realm or the underworld. But what makes them think this? They blamed the existence of the cave for crop failure, bad events, and illness. One of the prominent markings in the cave is the symbol of the Mother of Peace. Due to the size and depth of the cave system, locals feared that something might come out of it, and they sought to prevent that from ever happening. Wookey Hole was said to have had the largest amount of such markings, at 57, but the Robin Hood Cave ran well over 103. Something incredibly sinister must have taken place here for someone to be encouraged to inscribe so many markings all across the cave. It couldn't possibly be the works of mere superstition. There exists another theory, aside from trying to keep something at bay, though. Professor Ronald Hutton from Bristol University has suggested that something of a different realm may have been exorcised into the caves, and these markings are keeping it there. Some sort of ominous event must have occurred during this time, and the locals took it to their own hands to keep whatever entity had plagued them trapped in the cave forever. In 1982, a movie called The Entity was released. It was centered around a single mother who was attacked by an invisible force. She didn't believe that anything supernatural was happening, and that it was all due to a traumatic past. The woman invited some college students who were interested in the paranormal to visit her house and experience the going on for themselves. They then agreed to help her defeat the invisible entity. Many don't know that this movie is inspired by the true story of Doris Bither, who experienced a terrifying historical paranormal event. Doris and her 4 children moved to a house located at 11547 Braddock Drive in Culver City, California, after which an elderly woman would appear at her door. The woman had told her that she should leave the house and had lived there when she was young. She believed that there was something evil lurking within. The warning came as a shock, but the mother opted not to leave the new house, and the family began settling in. One of the sons later revealed that his mother also dabbled with the occult in earlier years. The story itself is tragic, and the shattered pieces must be put together using various sources and witness testimony. As it's understood, Doris had 3 sons and 1 daughter, but the daughter is not mentioned throughout the ordeal. And it's often said that the mother and the sons were the ones who witnessed the paranormal unfold before them. They each claimed to have seen semi-transparent entities that manifested as smoky apparitions with indistinct facial features. They were the size and shape of a human, although one report states that a singular apparition was much larger. Doris had been the main target of these beings, which would assault her on various occasions. The sons would often be bitten, scratched, or shoved by unseen forces. She would later overhear a conversation between 2 parapsychologists taking place at the local bookstore. Barry Taff and Carrie Gaynor worked at the University of California and were initially skeptical about the claims that she had made, but ultimately agreed to take a look. For 2 months, the investigators were stormed with bizarre poltergeist activity. Lights would flicker at random. Unexplained orbs would be caught on film cameras, and at one point, Doris was trying to coerce the entities, which worked as everyone in the room witnessed the haunting swell to crescendos. It was then that a green mist appeared, taking the shape of a large person. It was never clarified as to what happened after this, but the attacks on the mother slowly subsided. The haunting didn't stop entirely, even though they moved to different houses in different states. Strangely enough, the Culver City home has not seen any further paranormal activity ever since. A large portion of the events was attributed to Doris's traumatic past, but this would not explain what the sons had seen. What actually transpired there is an ongoing source of mystery and debate, since the case was not correctly or competently investigated. Whatever did happen was something truly haunting and terrifying. As time went on, the writer of the Entity novel, Frank DeFelida, stopped hearing from Doris, and it appeared that she'd vanished from existence. One of the paranormal experts, Barry, had been keeping in contact with her as well, but was unsure of her whereabouts. In 1995, it was reported that the woman had passed away, but conflicting sources say otherwise. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.